Hey, ladies and gentlemen, this is your boy Marcus, known from Gentleman Style Podcast, your host of the number one podcast coming to you live in America. And today we have a very special guest, an amazing guest, an incredible guest, a dynamic woman. Please, she is Miss Linda Gartz. She is a six-time Emmy-honored Linda Gartz, a documentary producer, family woman, mother, and just an incredible spirited woman. Her documentaries and TV productions have been featured on ABC, NBC, CBS, PBS, and Investigation Discovery, syndicated nationwide. Her educational videos include Begin with Love, hosted by Oprah Winfrey, and Grandparenting, hosted by Maya Angelou. Ms. Gartz's articles and essays have been published in literary journals, online, and in local and national magazines and newspapers, including the Chicago Tribune. That is no small feat. Born in Chicago, she studied at both Northwestern University and the University of Munich, and has lived most of her adult life in Evanston, Illinois. Miss Linda Gartz, my special guest, here today to share with us this book, this powerful, impactful book. I could not put this book down. It was a complete showstopper for me, so much to the point where I had to get a copy when I heard about it. And we are going to discuss, just like the title says, a memoir of race, change, and fractured community in the 1960s Chicago, Redlining. And Miss Linda Gartz, my special guest, is here today to help us and to educate us. So let's welcome her with some hearts, some love, some likes, some hearts. Please welcome my special guest, Miss Linda Gartz.
Hi, Marcus. Well, thank you so much for that beautiful introduction. I am so happy to be here. You are such a spirited person yourself. I think this is going to be a lot of fun. I'm really looking forward to talking with you about the book.
Me too. Thank you for being with us here today and sharing and giving back to my community. Miss Linda, thank you. I honor you.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate you.
So jumping right in, my very first question I have to ask, how would you describe the book in the simplest terms?
Well, if I were just to give like a one-sentence summary, this book is the story of my family's life on Chicago's West Side, that's interwoven with the history of redlining. And my family was there before, during, and after the racial changes that took place in Chicago, and not just Chicago, but communities throughout the country. But that's the simplest summary of my book, and it's got a lot more in it than that. But it's the history of my family interwoven with the history of redlining on the west side of Chicago.
And redlining, I think my audience I've been getting inbox messages, conversations. How would you describe redlining in the simplest terms possible?
Okay, again, in the simplest terms, and like anything, this can get more complex the more you delve into it. But in its simplest terms, redlining was a federal government policy that was in place from 1933 to 1968 that denied loans, especially home loans, to African Americans and other minorities simply because of the color of their skin. And because of that policy, which was in place, as I said, for 35 years, 1968 is when the Fair Housing Act was passed, right after, like weeks after Martin Luther King was murdered. It wasn't until 1968 that federal government policy was brought to an end. So that's the simplest terms. And we can talk more about that later when we look at some of the maps and so on.
Absolutely. That's incredible, and that's powerful because, especially now in the Black Lives Movement, racism is kind of coming front and center. Mm-hmm. But even with you growing up, it was, everything you saw. What did you see as a young girl growing up? Tell us about you growing up in Chicago in the 1960s and just your experiences with that.
Sure. Well, Chicago was then and is now still a very segregated city. And quite frankly, as white people, we never had an opportunity to ever interact with African Americans. There were white neighborhoods and there were black neighborhoods. And quite frankly, the myth that was promulgated among many white people was that if blacks moved into your community, then the community would sink and go down, and then the white people would lose their property values. But where that came from is that whites would drive through, for example, African American neighborhoods, and they would see, dilapidated buildings and grass that wasn't taken care of, and so on. But what we didn't realize was that, number one, nobody there could get a home loan. So if your roof was sagging, you couldn't get a Black African American person could not get a home loan to be able to fix that. They were denied home loans. And if there were, the windows needed repairing, and there were many times there were very absentee landlords is what they were called, meaning they didn't live on the property. And I won't say most, but so many of these absentee landlords didn't care about their property. Also, in many African American neighborhoods, which were, segregated due to redlining, polluting industries were often placed in these neighborhoods. And this is happening still today. And with polluting industries, it makes the neighborhood look worse because things get dirty. It also contributes to health problems that African Americans have had. So when I was growing up in the city, there was a fear of African Americans among white people. They were afraid that if African Americans moved into their community, then their community would also, as one woman said, I quote this in the book, there were some protests on the south side of Chicago in the 1950s because an African-American family had moved into a home on the south side of Chicago, in a place called South Deering. And whites were rioting and throwing bricks and attacking black passersby. And the news reports were there. And one news reporter, I think it was CBS, asked a woman, well, why don't you want African Americans in your neighborhood? And she said, and this is a quote, she said, every place they've come into, they've turned into a slum. So that was the attitude of whites. And so that was a big problem for African Americans because, of course, many African American families, just like white families, wanted their kids to be able to go to good schools. They wanted to be in safe neighborhoods. But the way it was set up in Chicago and many other northern cities, and this is after white African Americans started fleeing the South, and we can talk about that in a minute. But so the attitude was, we don't want African Americans in our neighborhood. But what happened in our neighborhood is in June of 1963, and by the way, 1963 was a very big year for the civil rights movement. In May of that year, I'm sure many of your listeners and you yourself have read about the Birmingham Children's March and how the Birmingham police turned fire hoses on those children and stick dogs on those children. And then Governor Wallace stood in front of the University of Alabama. He was the governor, and he was refusing entry to an African American man. And his stated premise of life was segregation today, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. So the federal government, that was Kennedy at the time, John Kennedy was the president, and his brother Bobby Kennedy was the attorney general. They had to send federal troops in June of 1963 to force this governor to let this African American go to a public university that he had paid taxes for. So that was the backdrop. And then, Kennedy went on a screen that night and talked to the American people and gave an impassioned speech to please treat your African American neighbors as citizens. So that was a speech he gave. I think it was June 11th. And the next day, Medgar Evers, who worked with the NAACP, was murdered in his driveway in front of his children. So that was the backdrop. Everything on the news every night was about the civil rights movement and the confrontations and so on. And with that as the backdrop, 10 days after Kennedy gave his speech, the first African American moved onto our block. And I remember my mom was very upset. She didn't know what to expect because she didn't know any African Americans. But then later, we'll talk about the diaries later, but she kept a diary, and she wrote in her diary a couple months later, she wrote, "I'm not at all unhappy. in this changing neighborhood. I really like my neighbors. So I thought that was a classic example of bringing people together to show humanity.
That is a powerful example of showing each other humanity. Your parents in the book that you described were they they didn't live together, and you go into detail about that. They owned a home. They own a beautiful home in Chicago, and they ran a business together, and they worked hard. Your mom was just so powerful, and you describe that, and you go into so much detail in this great book about everything that you were experiencing, and even before. Um, this is your home in the slide, y'all. This is Miss Linda Gartz's home where she grew up in the South Side of Chicago that you're looking at.
West Side,
And
West Side.
West Side,
I'm
forgive
in the
me,
West
West
Side.
Side.
Yeah, the South Side is really the more renowned African American part of the city. But this is the West Side. This is directly
Absolutely.
like if anybody has an image in their mind of Chicago, we're on the lake. If you go from downtown Chicago directly west from the heart of downtown, this is where I lived, 5 miles. So yeah, this was my home. Yeah, this was my beautiful home.
You mentioned racism. How 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 were how specifically how were people being um black people, African Americans were being violated against? Can you go into detail about that
Well,
specifically?
sure.
You touched on it with redlining, but can you touch on that specifically?
Well, sure. I mean, basically, first of all, I'm sure many of your listeners and you know about the horrible Jim Crow laws in the South. And African Americans started fleeing the South en masse. There were lynchings. You couldn't even get a library. A black couldn't get a library card. Sometimes, if blacks were successful, they were burned out because the whites were jealous. The South was just like an apartheid part of this country. Legally, this was legal segregation. There was segregation, and this was like codified in the laws how blacks and whites should not have the same drinking fountains, the same swimming pools, and so on. So I'm using this as a backdrop. We'll take this picture as an example. So African Americans started fleeing the South, in the early 20th century. And this picture that you're showing now is the picture of a photograph that was taken around 1919, 1920 of an African American family that had arrived in Chicago. And for the longest time, nobody knew anything about this family. And then our NPR station in Chicago here did some research, and they found out that this family was fleeing the South because one of the family members was accused of killing a white man. Whether he did or not, I don't know. But he was accused of it, and that was good enough for anybody to lynch people. So they had already grabbed some of the family. They had burned a couple of the young men at the stake. They had violated the women. And these are the people who managed to get away. And that's what was reported in a very famous Chicago newspaper here in Chicago. That was a black newspaper and still is in existence today, called the Chicago Defender. And that was the only only kind of newspaper that African Americans were able to get information about what's happening with blacks and their race. So here you see how it was actually a headline in the Chicago Defender: family driven from South by a mob. And that's what, you can't read the tiny print under the picture, but that's what it says, what I just told you about them being driven from the South. So I'm giving that as a background. So millions of blacks began fleeing the South and for the North, looking for, a fairer place to live. Well, the North didn't have codified segregation the way the South did, but it was not exactly welcoming. So whites did not want blacks in their neighborhoods. Most African Americans ended up on the South Side or near West Side. See, I say I'm on the West Side, but near West Side means they're nearer to downtown, so closer to the lake, but not in the expensive areas on the lake. And then south, and then you can see in this picture here, this is just a portion of Chicago. in a redlining map, which we can talk about too. But you were asking me about how, what happened when blacks came. Well, they were shoved into this very limited housing because they couldn't get out, to live into white neighborhoods. So many times the landlords would divide up an apartment into one apartment that was meant for one family into 4 parts. Sometimes a closet was turned into a bathroom with toilets that didn't work. So blacks were really not exactly welcomed with open arms, although we didn't have, people weren't necessarily lynching them here, although in 1919, we had some terrible race riots in 1919. But anyway, so redlining was alive and well in the North. And as you can see from this map, this is taken from a site that many of your viewers may be interested in. It's called mappinginequality.com. So if you write that down, mappinginequality.com, anybody who's watching this show or anybody at all can go onto this site for free and take a look at the original redlining maps that I mentioned were in place from 1933 to 1968. If we want to go back to that map for a minute, I'll tell you a little bit more about it. But I'd like to see the map that has the images. That one. There you go. Thank you. Okay, so this is a map from that site, mappinginequality.com. The University of Richmond digitized over about 239 maps. These are actual redlining maps that the government created in conjunction with the real estate sector and the banking sector that determined which neighborhoods could get loans, because the banks, they realistically want to know their money is safe. But what they did is they color-coded communities within a city. So again, I just want to look at this map of the United States because it shows how widespread this was, especially in the Midwest and Northeast. But you can see it goes all the way. There's redlining in Miami, Tampa, Jacksonville, all the way to the northwest of Seattle, Tacoma, Spokane, and so on. So this was not a uniquely Chicago phenomenon at all. This was a nationwide phenomenon. And the color codes meant this. If a neighborhood was considered to be top grade and its residents were all white, it didn't necessarily say all white, but it would say in the description that these were, upstanding residents. And the housing stock was really good and the people made good money. It would be colored green. That meant it was the best. The bank's money would be super safe. Then if it was considered to be, a still good stock, as they call it here, B, still desirable, then and you can be sure that was all white, then loans could be given. Now, C is definitely declining. And as you can see from this map, many of the cities have a lot of C. A lot of C, a lot of yellow. And then comes red, which was called hazardous. And that meant no loans were to be given. And typically, if one African American lived in a community, it didn't matter if he had a PhD or was a veteran, that community would be redlined, meaning they colored it red, and nobody in that community could get a home loan. Now, whites could leave. They could flee to the suburbs, which they did. And that's where the FHA money went. The FHA, which is the Federal Housing Authority, that's the authority that backs up loans. When you get a loan from a bank, the FHA guarantees that loan. Well, they wouldn't guarantee loans for African Americans. And so they would say, they had in their underwriting manual, it said, inharmonious racial groups should not live together. So that was in their wisdom. They didn't want inharmonious racial groups, i.e. blacks and whites, to live together. And this was a policy in place from 1933, believe it or not, through the Roosevelt administration, because they had to make a deal with the devil to get some other things passed. And then the only reason that the Fair Housing Act was passed in 1968 was because right after Martin Luther King was killed, President Lyndon Johnson at the time was able to push this through because there were riots all over the country. And the Southern Democrats who were trying to block this change in policy, you had to back down because there was so much uproar and rioting throughout the country after King's death. So that's where the redlining comes in. Now, if you want to take a look at my community, we can look at the next map that you showed, which is of Chicago. And again, as I mentioned, on the far right, I can't point to it, but on the far right, there's a little yellow sticker, and that says downtown Chicago. And if you follow that yellow sticker in a straight line west, you see another yellow sticker that says my house. So I was directly west of downtown Chicago. And as you can see, how much red, hazardous, no loans, and yellow there is in this city. So it's interesting to me to see how most cities were really, like our neighborhood was called definitely declining. Let's take a look at the next one, which is a close-up of my neighborhood. The map that shows a close-up of the area where my house is. That area, there you go. Now we have a beautiful park. Actually, I was just in this neighborhood last Friday. I was going to go to the beautiful conservatory at that funny little rectangle park there. It's like a rectangle with the square sticking out. That's Garfield Park. And I lived where the orange arrow is. And you see those X's. Those X's mean it was a commercial district. Well, one thing I would say that I never would have thought that my neighborhood was considered definitely declining, as the yellow shows, is because we had a vibrant commercial district. I mean, we had multiple clothing stores, restaurants, 2 bakeries, hardware stores, paint stores, dime stores, which don't exist anymore. But it was like a small town. You could get anything you wanted. And, so getting back to your question about what was it like growing up in this neighborhood, it was a delightful neighborhood when I was a kid. Those were the days of what they call now free range children, meaning that your parents weren't hovering over you every second. So, our moms, we'd go out, and run around all morning, who knows what we were doing, and come home for lunch and then run around again. This is, of course, in the summer. In school time, we'd go to school and come home and maybe play after school and then do some homework. But it was a delightful neighborhood. So the house that we lived in, that you showed the house before, if we want to go back to the house picture, we don't have to. I can just talk about it. The thing about our house, my parents bought that home. It was a Greystone 2-flat. Greystone is very typical Chicago building. They're beautiful buildings. And and at that time, okay, there you can see it. At that time, I don't know if you can see this, but the windows at the top, the windows were leaded glass. Now, since then, those have either been literally stolen. I mean, sometimes people would come at night and they would literally steal a part of your window because they knew they could sell it. People, some bad actors, criminals would come at night and cut out the window. It's unbelievable. But we had my dad's idea was that he wanted this to be a rooming house. His parents, my father's parents, settled in this neighborhood, West Garfield Park, in 1912. So they were immigrants to this country from what is today Romania, but they were ethnic Germans. They spoke German. They had this, a German culture. But they didn't have a high education, but they were very smart, and they were willing to work their butts off and save everything. I mean, I don't know anybody today who knows how to save like they did. I mean, they saved at one point 75% of their salary. Now, to be fair, they eventually became janitors, so they were able to get housing probably at no cost because they managed buildings as well as being janitors. They were the people that would rent the buildings and so on. But that's how they saved so much money that they were eventually able to buy their own homes and become landlords themselves, even as they continued their work as janitors. And so that was the kind of upbringing my dad had. Now, my grandmother, who only had a 4th grade education, was determined that all her sons would go to college. So that was another reason to save. But so my dad went to a community college first, and he eventually graduated from what is today known as IIT, Illinois Institute of Technology. But his upbringing was that of a working class person, right? He worked with his dad. They shoveled coal. We had coal burning furnaces. They had to, wheelbarrow coal in and shovel it into the furnaces so it would heat the buildings. It was super cold. They might have to go down at 2 a.m. and refill them. They had to shovel all the walks, and you can believe me, that was done perfectly. So they really, you're in Virginia, so it doesn't have that much snow there, but we could get some pretty big snowstorms here with a lot of snow. And my dad kept a diary too, and he talked about in his diary how they would, shovel all the snow in the evening, then get up at like 6 a.m. to shovel again because it was snowing all night. And then he would go to school and bring his work home. But he always had work to do around the house. So his idea was to turn this into a rooming house. So what he did, in the second floor, he transformed it into 5 sleeping rooms. This is sort of like what I told you that other people had done. But the difference is that my parents were absolutely meticulous about upkeep. My dad, having been raised as a janitor's son whose job it was to make sure everything was clean and perfect, I mean, they took care of everything perfectly. So they had 5 sleeping rooms in which were rented to only men, because it would not be very moral to have women in there too. And then the back part of it was it was like a small apartment. So there was a kitchen, a bedroom, a bathroom, and what would have been the dining room now is a living room with a pull-out couch. So a small family could live there. And then he had this brilliant idea about putting 3 apartments in the basement, which my mother was violently against. But he was just determined. I think he wanted to impress his parents. And he went ahead with that. I don't know how he convinced her, but he did persuade her to do it. And then that was at the time when he had to travel. He got a job traveling. So he was traveling like 6 months out of the year. In the winter, he'd be gone for sometimes 5 to 7 weeks, the worst part of the winter. So she's shoveling coal. She's shoveling snow. She's taking care of little children. She's taking care of 11 tenants.
While your husband's away.
While her husband is away. While her husband is away, she's doing this all herself. And when they first moved into the second floor, that's where they first moved. They just moved right in. The woman who was living there at the time, they didn't ask her to leave. They just moved in with her and the roomers that she was renting to. So they were living with these strange people in the same apartment. And then my dad would go on these trips with these guys in the apartment. It was unbelievable. My mother was pure as the driven snow, so there was no problem there. But nevertheless, just the thought, but it was a different era, to be fair. During the Depression, my mother's parents had to split up their apartment to try to make ends meet because her father was unemployed. But anyway, so I grew up in a rooming house. I mean, the roomers were all very nice. None of them ever tried anything with me. I hear stories of abuse. Nobody ever did anything bad to me, but they would come down every Saturday and pay the rent. But that was, so this was their main investment, as we talked about, But like I said, they being white and my grandparents being white were able to invest in property, but African Americans were not, because they were denied loans. And today, we know that African Americans have somewhere between 5 and 10% the wealth that whites do, because whites have built most of their wealth. I'm not talking salary, I'm talking wealth, by owning property. And then this is money that can be passed on to their children. It's money that can be used in an event like we're experiencing now, a pandemic. If you need a backup, you have some savings, you have investment because of the buildings you owned. Of course, who knows what's happening. People could also lose their homes during this horrible time. But anyway, that was our lives, and it was a very, everything seemed very nice and normal to me. When the first African Americans moved on the block in '63, immediately the white flight began. Within 2 months, like 2/3 of the house had been turned over. Whites had left and African Americans moved in. Certainly within the year, by 1966, the neighborhood was entirely African American. And if you read, well, I don't have a picture of it in my book, but my graduating class from the local grade school had 5% African Americans. I think there were 4 blacks out of about 74 kids. The following year, 1963, after they had changed the school boundaries, that graduating class was about 57% African American. So that's how fast the neighborhood changed. But it was it, you know, for us as kids, we just thought it was a great neighborhood. And my parents did, well, actually, I found the place we moved to because it was next door to my best friend. But yeah, they weren't looking, but then I saw this house next door to my best friend, just directly 5 miles north, was for sale. It was a fixer-upper. We went, but a really pretty home. And we went and looked at it, and everybody kind of fell in love with it. The idea of not having to live with tenants for the first time in our lives was something that really, and it was just a beautiful home. It had lots of space. My dad collected lots of all sorts of junk. And so we being, you know, our we kids were like, I was a senior in high school, my brother was in college, but we all were going to school locally. So we all pitched in, we painted. My brother spent like 3 days without sleeping painting the basement. I stripped off wallpaper, we plastered, we painted, we put in the sweat equity. And while they did not sell their houses on the west side. So not only did they have this big new house to take care of and fix up, they still had the 3 apartment buildings on the west side, which they did not sell.
All maintained under your family. This y'all, please like, share, and subscribe. You're not gonna get this kind of value. This impactful woman, Miss Linda Gartz, is here sharing and giving back. That's powerful to me. This book took me on an emotional roller coaster. But by the way, you can get this book on Amazon and most Barnes and Noble and most.
Oh, not Barnes and Noble. They forgot to do their duty. But anyway, so Barnes and Noble. Yeah, I'm sorry. They should have been able to have it. But go ahead. But it's like, yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
But you're fine. This book, it was worth every page. I finished the book in a day. And everything Miss Linda shared with us today is in here. It was impactful and it's insightful. I could not turn it away. I could not put it down. Everywhere in my home, I took the book with me, and I was determined to read it.
Okay. You're making me blush.
I have to be honest. My audience, you're a servant like me, and this book, because I wasn't aware of redlining. I wasn't aware that we were treated that way. Your parents, you discovered something. You mentioned it. You say your family was a hoarder, but you discovered something very unique in your parents' home. Can you tell us about that? Can you share what those was?
Yeah. This is actually what inspired me to write the book. Well, it was a startling event for us. After my mom died in 1994, and my brothers and I were. Yeah, thank you. You know, but we all got to go. But that was too early for her. Anyway, so she passed away in 1994, and then my dad had passed away earlier. So my brothers and I were going through the house I described to you, that the newer house that we had purchased, and we were separating trash from treasure. You know how you do. You know, this is junk, throw it out. This we have to keep. Well, in the attic we found gold, and by gold I don't mean literal gold, but gold of family history. We discovered that my parents and grandparents had saved thousands and thousands of pages of letters, diaries, documents, you know, photos, you name it, they saved it from like 1910 until my mom died. And the other interesting thing is everybody loved to write. You know, I mentioned my grandparents only had a 4th grade education, but both of them kept diaries of their trips to America, written in German, so I had to, deal with that, which I'm a German major, so I could read it, but I couldn't read the handwriting. But anyway, this is a little tiny portion of one box, and you can see the diaries I've opened, and the upper right-hand corner is a picture of my dad from, I think that's his high school graduation. Down in the middle lower, that's my husband and me back in the 80s. And then you see, you can just see that you can tell by just glancing at some of these pictures how old they are. So we've decided that what we would do is we would divide it up into bankers boxes based upon who the article or item was related to. So we had a box for my dad's parents. We had a box for, there we go. We had a box for my mom's parents, for my mom, for us, and so on. So then we ended up with 25 bankers boxes, and here is a picture of them stored in my garage. And I still have them in my house and garage. I'm thrilled to say that they are going to be donated to the Newberry Library, which is a wonderful research library here in Chicago. So they won't be thrown away. They will be able to be used for research for, as long as there's civilization, this library will be there. If we all go to, whatever.
Yes, we will.
But anyway, so we put it in these bankers boxes. I shoved them into my garage for a long time while I was raising my two boys. And we made a spreadsheet of these because there was so much stuff. We wanted to have a way to keep track of it. And if you have that image of the spreadsheet, you won't be able to read it closely, but it'll just give you an idea of how we tried to keep track of these things. This is one page of about an 8 or 10 page spreadsheet. So we, in the first column, you can see is the number of the box, and then the date and the person that it refers to, and then just a brief description of what's in there. Not like if my mother might say my mother's scrapbook, but it won't give you everything that's in the scrapbook. But anyway, this helped. This was a tremendous help for me in being able to go through these items. Well, anyway, those things stayed in my garage for many years. And then somewhere around 2002, a little nagging voice said to me, wonder I have to read what's in there. So I started out, I have 300 World War II letters. These are letters written to and from my uncle when he was studying to be a navigator for a B-17 bomber during World War II. And so these are about 300 letters that go back and forth between my uncle and his family and friends. And I was hooked. I mean, those letters were so vivid, they just made me feel like I was whisked back to the 40s. So then I started, I was like hooked. Okay, I've got to read everything. So I started reading my mom's diaries and my dad's diaries. But the diary that really appealed to me the most, and it was so adorable, was my mother's diary of falling in love with my dad. And so here's just an image of her diary. She was very fastidious, and she writes the dates on the front of each diary. So this goes, as you see, November 20th, 1939 to October 20th, 1941. Well, in May of 1941, my mom went to a dance in downtown Chicago. This was typical 1940s. They'd have these big bands, and the girls and guys would show up and hoping to meet a partner, for the evening or maybe for life. Who knew? So my mom goes to this dance, and whom should she see there but Fred Gartz? Oh my God. She had met him once before, and they'd have a marvelous time, but he never called her for a date. So she thought, second chance. So she went up to him, and they started talking, and they danced the night away. There's a cute picture of them, which I'll get to that real quickly. Anyway, they danced the night away, and when she came home, I have this memorized by now. She tore open she tore open her diary and wrote, he is definitely the man I want to marry. He's intelligent, funny, and we have no ends of things to talk about. But my dad waited 3 months to ask her for a date.
What?
Yeah, I know. This gal had to be giving off such vibes, right? He was kind of shy. So he waited 3 months. August 15th, 1941, they went on their first date. And what they did is they first walked through Lincoln Park, which is a beautiful park that includes a zoo right on the lakefront. And then they walked to see a movie. Then they walked to a brewery to have a beer and a ham sandwich. And then they went back to the park. And when my mother got home that night, what she wrote, I can read it from my book because it's so cute. She says, let's see here. I have first day.
Miss Linda, you're muted.
Maybe I must have accidentally hit something. All right,
Nope,
where did
now
I
we can
go?
hear you.
Okay, sorry. I think I accidentally hit the mute button.
You're fine.
So we kissed for about an hour and a half. Did you hear that already?
No, we
Oh,
right when you was looking for the diary.
oh, okay. All right, I'll start it again then. Okay, so my mom comes home and she writes this. I think we both knew why we went back to the park. We sat on a bench hearing the lions roar and the quacking of a duck. Oh, it was heavenly. He knows all the little innuendos of kissing, and I ain't so bad myself if I do say so. We kissed for about an hour and a half, right? Could you imagine any kids today kissing for an hour and a half without going farther? No.
No.
Tonight, and these weren't kids, they were like in their 20s. Tonight was like a page from a storybook, and he definitely is the man I want to marry. Dear God, please let it come true. So obviously she is smitten, and these kind of entries go on for like a year, of dating. They're just dating most of the time. She does get mad at him when he doesn't ask her out for New Year's Eve, but then she forgives him. And somewhere in May, he actually finds his voice. And I don't know, do you want me to read that? Or do you want to go on into something else?
Please,
Okay.
please read. Can you read that for us? What?
Okay, so this is what she writes when Dad finds his voice. Fred told me at 2:30 a.m. Sunday, May 17th, really that he loves me. One split second before he did so, I murmured, "Je t'aime," which means I love you in French, which of course he did not understand. Ever since then, we have been happier than ever before in our lives. Fred tells me the nicest things, that he loves me more all the time, that I get sweeter as time goes by, that he's never loved anyone like he has loved me, that he's wanted many things badly in his life, but never anything half so much as he wants me. We have never had an argument since our first date, August 15th, 1941. So if we won't be happily married, who will? By the way, gentlemen who might be listening, there are some good lines there for you to remember with your girlfriend, right? And he meant them. So yeah, so the thing that happened, however, that I thought that's a very sweet. If we won't be happily married, who will? Well, by the time I was a teenager, my parents were definitely not happy. My mom was screaming at my dad. My dad was retreating. She was furious because, it finally all congealed about all this responsibility that had been dumped on her while he had been traveling. Not that he didn't work. He worked very hard. He would come home from his day job, take off his suit and tie, and put on work clothes and work till 1 a.m. So he was no sloth, but he really did put an undue burden on her. So that was one of the reasons I wanted to read through these diaries and letters, was to try to figure out what had happened to their relationship, and at the same time try to figure out what had happened to our neighborhood, which is how I learned about redlining, which I've already talked about. But they were it was a tough time when I was a teenager and young adult. My parents were very unhappy, and that made me very unhappy. So I was using this posthumous opportunity, and now my husband says we want to get them back for a seance because I had so many questions from my mom and dad, like why they made the decisions they made, and then on top of all this, my mother's mother, I called her Grandma Kay, lived with my parents from the time 10 months after they were married. My mother invited her mother to live with the newlyweds because he was very despondent after my mother's father had died. So my grandmother was despondent. She lost her husband. They lost their home to foreclosure during the Depression. She lost her daughter to marriage. So, she thought, so in comes Grandma Kay. And basically she lived with them for a while off and on, and then pretty permanently for like 15 years. And she was seriously mentally ill. And that mental illness had a big impact on my parents' relationship, because this woman was really needed to be in an institution. And she was actually, when she went to for a mental evaluation, the doctors went to the courtroom and said she's a proper person to be in an institution. But my mother didn't want to send her to an institution. So she lived with us as she got really more and more mentally unstable, and that was a real hardship. And my mother was between a rock and a hard place as an only child, So I empathize with her, but at the same time, I feel like she should have found a place for her mother much sooner. But you can
Put her foot down.
Pardon me?
Put her foot down with her husband.
Well, he had to put his foot down with her.
Right.
Both ways. I mean, both ways.
Both
I mean,
ways.
Yeah, both ways. She needed to put her foot down about him, get a job in Chicago, don't be traveling. And he needed to put his foot down and say, this woman is wrecking our marriage and our home life, meaning the grandmother. But, this is the life they lived. I can't, they're dead. I sometimes wish I could go find them and talk to them and say, why did you do this? But, they lived a life. We all live our lives. We all have troubles. They raised good kids. They taught us a lot of the values that we have today, which includes compassion.
Right. That's powerful. All of this, y'all, please like, share, and subscribe. This is Gentleman Style Podcast coming to you live with Miss Linda Gartz, talking about her incredible book, Redlining. And she goes into detail about this, y'all. She goes into very specific detail about Grandma Kay. Grandma Kay played a very unique role in that family dynamic. Miss Linda Gartz goes into great detail. During that time, the United States had just discovered electrifying the brain, ECG.
Yeah, electroshock therapy. I think I think it was EST. Anyway, it was what they call today shock therapy.
Therapy.
Shock. Yeah, that's the common usage, but it was called something more scientific. But everybody understands what that means.
And it was traumatic. And imagine going through that. Miss Linda, what do you have in store for us? What do you have? Are you able to share what you have for our audience today?
Well, what I in writing this book, I at first I didn't know what the focus was. That was the hardest thing. I had all this material, literally. I mean, I spent literally years going through it, keeping track of it, making spreadsheets, trying to figure out how I'd remember quotes that I wanted to use. So I started out, I didn't know what the focus should be. I knew I wanted to include the racial change, but I had this sprawling family history that I could tell. I could literally have written 50 to 100 different books depending on what focus I wanted to take. What's the life of a janitor? What's it like to live in a rooming house? All those kinds of things. So I just decided to put everything in that I thought I liked and was important. And I ended up with 135,000 words, which would be like about a 700-page book. So I knew that was impossible. So I found an editor and I asked her to please read through this tome and tell me what she thought did not fit and what would be the best focus. And she started going through, didn't make any corrections or, grammar or anything like that. Just like, okay, this part about your grandparents in Romania, get it out. Too much detail. I had 40 pages about my uncle in World War II to begin with. Now it's like a 3 or 4 page chapter. So, we just whittle, because she said, that's important to your family, but all the detail you put isn't necessary. So that's how, and then, we both agreed, that the essence of this story was the racial change. And that's what I should build it around, but interweave it with the family, because you couldn't leave the family story out. I mean, I wanted to tell the family story. I wanted to find what happened to my parents. And I wanted to write a book that would speak to other people, because every family has problems. And I think that people if they read this book, they can identify, even if they don't have the same problems, they can see issues in their own homes, in their own lives, in their own families that cause problems. And I, as I say, the first thing I would have done to my parents if I'd been older and wiser would have sent them to counseling. I mean, don't be afraid of therapy. I mean, it's so important to help people get a grounding and feel better, I think. And even if my dad would have refused to go, I would have said to my mother, you go to therapy because you need to figure out how to deal with everything you're dealing with. emotionally and so on.
Yes.
So yeah, so that was so my point in saying what's next is I have like 35,000 words of work that I really worked very hard on and really made good writing. So what I'd like to do, I'm hoping, is to maybe create a book of essays. Or the other thing I'm thinking about, and whether I get to it or not is interesting, is just writing a book just about my mother and what it was like to be an ambitious, smart, determined, hardworking woman when all she puts on our income tax that she completely did was housewife. She was so much more than a housewife.
She was more.
Nothing wrong with a housewife. Fine to be a housewife, but my mom was a businesswoman and really, really very strong and able to handle so much. But you had mentioned earlier, Marcus. Yeah, I did want to get, because I interrupted you. I'm sorry.
You're fine.
Today, and for a few days, the ebook of Redlined is going to be on sale for 99 cents. And most of you probably might use Amazon. You have to get it, through a place like Amazon, Apple Books, Google Play, and Kobo. I'm not familiar with Kobo, but anyway, on those 4 platforms, you can get the book for 99 cents. Oh, here he's showing up a picture of the page, and you can see the price has been reduced from $9.99 to 99 cents. And if you look on the right side, it says "Buy for others." So you could, for the price of one regularly priced ebook, you could get 9. So think about it as, early gifts. And when you buy it for others, you can say when you want it delivered. So you could have it delivered Christmas Eve or whenever. So just a thought. I hope if you're, if you want to be able to read it, it's a great deal, and you could share it with your friends. So I hope you do.
That's an incredible deal, y'all. You heard it live and direct from the author herself. A special gift from her to you, and right on time for the holidays.
Right on time for the holidays. You are so right on.
99 cents. It didn't matter to me. This book, I paid full price, and I don't feel any bit ashamed. I was so glad to read this. This was a absolute showstopper. I keep it everywhere. But for my audience, for Gentleman Style Podcast, you all get to hear this first. 99 cents on Amazon. Get the book. Buy the book, y'all. You won't regret it. It is an absolute must read. It is a perfect balance between memoir, history, education, lessons, all happening right here between our very own eyes. And Miss Linda Gartz has peeled back the onion for us and did the work and taken the time to really educate and stimulate us. Miss Linda, I know one of them, but what are your 3 favorite books you would recommend to audiences today?
Goodness. Well, now, all right. This is a really tough one because I have so many books I like so much. I read, dozens of memoirs. To write this book, I had to learn how to really write. I was a TV writer, but that's totally different kind of writing. So I took a lot of writing classes and I read a ton of memoirs. Okay, memoir. What would be a good one to recommend? Let's see. Well, let's see. In memoir, there's so many great ones.
There are a lot of good ones.
There's The Glass Castle, which is about a very it makes my family look totally normal. The Glass Castle is about a very super dysfunctional parents, but it's fabulously written. I'm going to have to say more than one. I loved Wild by Cheryl Strayed, which is a woman who was trying to find herself after getting into drugs and having a lot of bad things happen to her. And so she decides to hike the Pacific Crest Trail in California by herself, having never done anything like that. And that's also a powerful book about resilience and strength and so on. Let's see. In terms of fiction, okay, another memoir. This is a very old memoir, but it's one of my favorites. It's written by Russell Baker. Russell Baker just died in the last 6 months or so. He was 96. He was born the same year as my uncle. He writes a book called Growing Up. and it's about growing up during the Depression, the Great Depression of the 1930s. And he was a brilliant writer for the New York Times. He was a columnist, and he used humor. So sometimes people called him a humorist. He was so much more. And if you read this book, you'll see why. Humor is throughout the book, but it is deep and meaningful, and you will be delighted with it. So those are some, and then let's see, what have I, oh, and of course I must mention Isabel Wilkerson's The Warmth of Other Suns. If you want to learn about the Great Migration that I mentioned, and African Americans coming from the South, which is a major part of our history that unfortunately is not taught in schools like so much of Black history, get The Great Migration. It's a big book. Just be prepared to sit down with it for a while, or get it on audio tape and listen to it. It's called The Warmth of Other Suns by Isabel Wilkerson. That's nonfiction. Fiction, it's hard for me to, I would almost have to look at my shelf. I'm trying to think of a fiction book. I liked, I read mostly nonfiction, but I like Ann Patchett. If any of you ever have heard of her, she wrote a wonderful book called Truth and Beauty. Well, that's nonfiction. She also wrote Bel Canto, and you know how it's going to end, but it's about a very fancy group of people somewhere in South America having a big party, and all of a sudden they're stormed by rebels who are holding them hostage. And it's the story of how the relationships develop between the hostage takers and the hostages. And actually, some people fall in love. So that's a really good book. So those are just a few. You can go on my website and find other things I say.
Absolutely. Go on Miss Linda Gartz's website. You can reach her at www.lindagartz.com. Miss Linda Gartz, I gotta ask, how do you, besides your book, besides the special promotion you did, how do you give back to your community?
Well, we have an organization here in Evanston. Evanston is a diverse community. We, like the high school, is about 40% African American, and we're on the North Shore of Chicago, which is generally thought of as like a white enclave. But Evanston is one of the only places that is really diverse, and that's why I chose to live here. So we have a wonderful organization here in Evanston called the Evanston Community Foundation, and I like to give to them, to donate to them, because they have their finger on the pulse of the needs of Evanston, whether it's, a homeless shelter, or whether it's, moms who need help, or need help with learning how to breastfeed, or learning how to read to their kids. So that's one of the main things I do. And I've just started something that's called a donor advisory fund, which is going to allow me to, give to lots of different organizations. And that's what I just plan to take a look at all the organizations that are doing good things for our environment, and for social justice. And I want to, donate to those. And then I hope to someday be able to help something more on the West Side. I think the West Side it's still a broken place. I'm sorry to say, 52 years after King's death and the riots that consumed it. On the very first page, the homepage of my website, I have a video book trailer. And at the start of that video trailer, you will see the conflagration, the fires raging that came as a part of those riots and basically burnt out most of the West Side. So that was sad. And it still hasn't come back 52 years later. It's bad.
That is bad.
So,
Miss Linda, how can my audience reach out to you? How can they connect with you? How can they connect with the movement? You're an entire movement. You're changing the world in so many positive ways.
Well,
how can my audience get a hold of
little things. I feel, and I'm talking about giving. I mean, one of the things I feel like it's not so much about selling books. Frankly, I'm never going to make the money back. I hope you do buy a book, but I'll never make the money back for the time and effort and money I put into this book. So that's not my goal. My goal is really to, like you said, Marcus, that you hadn't heard of redlining. You are not alone. I would say most of the young people I talk to, by that I mean, by young, I mean anybody under 50, most of them haven't heard of redlining, black or white. Now, if they're in real, people are in real estate, they know. So I feel like by sharing this information, that's really important to raise people's consciousness about what has happened and to help us understand, why we see these protests, around George Floyd's murder. And why, what's happening today with COVID and African Americans. African Americans are dying at twice the rate of white Americans from COVID because they live in these segregated neighborhoods where pollutants have been placed, where they have lower education opportunities. And, so they have underlying health conditions. They have no good food.
No access to health care.
Pardon me?
No access to
not as
healthcare.
great access to healthcare in many cases. And then, so there are real world consequences today that are still lingering from the redlining that was supposedly ended in 1968. But these segregated neighborhoods today can all be traced back. Most of them can be traced back to redlining. So that's another way I feel, by doing these kinds of things, I can give back, and by helping to educate people about what happened and let them learn about a family that lived through it.
Absolutely. Y'all, there's a link at the bottom at Amazon. Please, support this movement. Support Miss Linda. Support me. I'm asking my audience today. You're not going to get a better deal anywhere else. 99 cents. This will not last long. I'm telling you guys, this will not last long.
No.
Click on the link, tune in, get the book, read, and stimulate and take it and move with it. Don't just take this information today and do nothing with it. It was impactful to me. I'll say it. It's a life changer. It changed my life.
You are just amazing. Can I say I love you?
I love you too, Miss Linda.
I love your enthusiasm and your you just bring so much joy to this.
I have to. I can't talk about it enough. Get the book, y'all. Get the book. Miss Linda, any closing remarks, any final nuggets from my audience that you want to leave with us today?
I would just say, I do hope you read the book. If you do read it and do like it, I hope you will go to Amazon and leave a review. You don't have to write, an essay. All you have to do is a couple sentences is needed, but that's very important because, those reviews let Amazon know. I mean, one of the reasons I was able to get this deal for 99 cents is because of that I have, a lot of very good reviews and I need as many as I can. So that would be great. And also just, right now, with after the murder of George Floyd, there's been a lot of consciousness raising, and people are much more aware. I've seen more white people trying to understand racial issues. So, use this opportunity to educate yourself. There's just all you have to do is Google, racial inequality, or how can I learn more about race? There are so many good books out there. That would be informative and, let you know what you can do.
Absolutely. This is powerful, y'all. Miss Linda, I'm not going to take up any more of your time. I could stay here all day. I'm not going to, but I could.
Yeah, my husband's going to make dinner for me.
Exactly. We want to get you to dinner on time. Miss Linda, I adore you. You are impactful. You're changing lives. You're helping change the community. I thank you so much for everything you're doing.
Thank you for having me. And, let's keep in touch.
Absolutely, we will. So, like always, y'all, thank you all for subscribing. Thank you all for tuning in. This is Marcus Norman and Miss Linda Gartz signing off from Gentleman Style Podcast. And I hope this message was serving you all. Like always, take care of your friends, take care of your families, and take care of business. This is Marcus Norman and Miss Linda Gartz signing off.